Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our presentation of Burnside Unbound, where we bring our author events to you in the comfort of your own home. My name is Kate, and tonight I'm very excited to chat with local Adelaide aid worker and now author, Mary Venner. Welcome, Mary.
Hi, Kate. Thank you very much for having me. I'm really sorry that we can't be there in person, but we'll see how this goes.
Thank you. So to begin with, Burnside Live, we would like to acknowledge that this land that we meet on today is the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. Now, a big thank you to all of our attendees who are zooming in on our conversation with Mary this evening. If you'd like me to ask Mary a question on your behalf, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen and type in your question. If you cannot see the icon, then just let your mouse cursor hover over the base of the Zoom screen. Now grab your cuppa or a glass of wine, hot chocolate, and sit back and relax. So Mary, again, thank you so much for your time this evening, and congratulations on the publication of your memoir, Where Are You This Time? I absolutely love this title. Can you please tell us why you named your book Where Are You This Time?
Right. Well, because I've been to so many different countries. I was out of Australia for many years. Every time I came back and caught up with friends, they would sort of say, well, basically, where are you working now? Where are you this time? And it became a little bit of a joke. You know, I was Mary, my friend Mary from Afghanistan. Oh no, my friend Mary from Kazakhstan, and so on. So that was the title I came up with. It seemed to sum everything up.
Excellent. So I guess to begin with, how did you come to be working in these war-torn countries?
Right. Well, it was quite interesting. It came out of the blue. It wasn't something I was actively looking for. And just one day I opened my email and found a message there from somebody called Mike, who said he was in Washington and working for an American company, consulting firm, that was looking for people to go and work in Kosovo. At the time, Kosovo had just come out of a conflict as part of the Balkan Wars, and the UN had sent in a peacekeeping force, and aid organisations were sending people to help with post-conflict reconstruction. So some people will remember that, but it's a while ago now. So I had no idea who Mike was. I had no idea where he got my name from at the time, but he was looking for people to work in public finance, and that was what I'd been doing mainly when I was in I was in Canberra at the time, working for the government. And so I just said yes. And then his assistant took over and said, well, it would be easier if you booked your own flights to Macedonia, which was next door to Kosovo. Oh, and don't forget to bring a lot of money, cash, in Deutschmarks, in small notes, because, you know, and there'll be a guy called Errol, a taxi driver, at the airport to meet you. So that sounded fair enough to me. So I booked my flight and headed off. So in retrospect, yes, it did sound a little bit, it could have been a bit suspect, but I had by then found out what the connection was, that colleagues who knew about this project had suggested my name, but nobody bothered to tell me. Anyway, I turned up at Skopje Airport in Macedonia, and yeah, there was a guy there called Errol waiting for me. And he drove me about 2 hours into Kosovo, and it was February, it was the middle of winter, it was pretty bleak. And well, I thought Errol would look after me and know exactly what I was meant to be doing and where I was meant to be going, but he had no idea. He just knew to drive me to Pristina. And when I got there, he said, "Where are you staying?" And I had no idea. Luckily, it turned out there was really only one hotel in Pristina, and they did in fact have a reservation for me, which was very reassuring. But then there was no one to meet me. I expected instructions. I expected some form of contact. My phone didn't work over there. There was no internet. The hotel phone didn't work.
Oh dear.
Really, I sat there my first morning thinking, where am I? What have I done? But
were you tempted to get back on the plane and just go, nah, I can't do this?
No. I thought, oh, there must be a solution, and I did work out that because I did have a few contact names. I didn't have their phone numbers, but I found out where the United Nations office headquarters was, and I went and just asked them, do you know these people? And they said, oh, yes, they're down the road in that other building. And I went there, and it turned out that some of the people who were working there were actually people I already knew. I didn't know they were there until I got there.
So there were some familiar faces.
It was such a relief, because by then I was incredibly jet lagged. And and it was all a little bit overwhelming.
So from that point, you were given some, I guess, work to do. What kind of work did you start doing?
Well, the first project I worked on was actually a report on what would need to be done to repair all the war damage to actually get Kosovo back after years of damage and neglect.
That sounds like a massive job.
It was pretty massive, because there were a team of people, and they basically counted every school and assessed how much it would cost to repair, and hospitals, roads, all the infrastructure, but also things like the quality of the healthcare, the teacher training, what would need to be done, how are they going to get telephone services back, because it had all been bombed. So that was meant to be a 6-week project. And then I was meant to go home, go back to work. But they asked me whether I was prepared to continue there. And so after a few weeks back in Australia, I went back again. I put everything in Canberra into storage and flew back to Kosovo and stayed there in the end for about 3 years.
Goodness.
During which time I had 3 different jobs. I worked on the budget for the new government, and then I worked on the education financing and reform, and the last job I had was to do with setting up a civil service, setting up a public service. When the UN left, they needed local people to take over. The UN hasn't officially left yet, but they have got a local government up and running. So it was a question about the terms and conditions of employment and training and rules and regulations about how to set up a public service. All really fascinating projects.
And so just to fill in the gaps for our listeners, we did talk about this just before, but what background do you come from in order that you had the right skills to be placed in Kosovo?
Right. Well, I worked in Canberra for about 16 years. I worked most of the time. I was in the Department of Finance, working on budget issues, exactly like the issues I was dealing with when I went to Kosovo. So I tell people, well, I was doing exactly the same work. I was just doing it in really unusual circumstances. Mm-hmm. So when I had a bit of an economics degree, which helped, but mainly I had an anthropology background, and that really helped, because you're working in different cultures.
Okay.
Some of them are very different, and it helps to understand that people might not see the world the way you do, and what they're doing actually makes sense to them, even though to you it looks totally inexplicable.
Sorry, go on.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that after Kosovo, my next job was in Afghanistan, which was also just um, after the war, after the Americans went in, after the Taliban left. And that was a completely different situation, much worse situation in terms of damage and in terms of security. And I stayed there for a couple of years. And then, since then, I've been to the Philippines, Somalia, Libya, and also Kazakhstan and Ukraine, which are pretty comfortable, and Qatar, which is one of the most interesting places.
Okay, why do you say that?
So the book goes through what it was like in each of those places and what I did there.
Fantastic. I guess I'm very curious to find out what are some of the frustrations you faced while working abroad.
Right. Well, it's different in every country.
Mm-hmm.
The issues, so things don't work as smoothly as, you know, there's so many things that we take for granted.
For example?
Electricity.
Okay, wow. Yes, we do.
That's one, clean water, things like that, and security. Also things that we take for granted that our government can deliver to us that simply are not available to people in some countries. So, for instance, if you work for the government in Australia, you can be pretty sure you'll get your salary paid into your bank account every 2 weeks a year. If you work for the government in a lot of other countries, and that includes, in particular, Afghanistan, you might be a teacher or a medical worker, and you really have no idea when you're going to get your salary or if you're going to get your salary, because the government processes, they don't have computers, they don't really know how much money they have, or else they actually haven't got any money. And there are people along the way who might take a cut out of your salary before you actually get it in any case. So one of the things that I spent a lot of time working on in Afghanistan, which was a frustration, was trying to get the various systems they had in place to manage their money to be more responsive, to be quicker, and to actually get money out and spend it where it was needed, which is a pretty important part of getting the economy going and also recovering from the traumatic experiences they'd had in the past. So that's a problem in a lot of countries. And, you know, people from, you know, like me get frustrated because you can see that things need to change, and the people there, understandably, might not want to rush in and throw away systems they've been using for 30 or 40 years because some foreigner comes in and tells them they ought to. So there were frustrations like that. After a while, you know, but I understand it. I understand why they're sometimes reluctant.
And how did you build up that trust within, you know, every time you started somewhere new, you had to get these people to trust you and your management skills?
Yep, that's right. And there are some people that I don't think I ever won over. But on the other hand, in the situations, most of the situations I've been in, people are really keen to have some help.
Okay.
Because they're getting not only someone telling them what to do, but they're also getting training, they're getting new computers, they're getting a new office often. And when they're coming out of the sort of situation people in Afghanistan have been through, then they're very keen to work with foreigners. And in other countries, they are just so used to having lots of aid donors, having lots of people coming to basically do things for them, that they just accept whatever you say, which is another danger. They need to be able to challenge you as well and say, well, no, that won't work.
Mm-hmm. In your book, you don't shy away from stating your observations, even if they might be a little bit controversial. At one point, you wrote, I found that donor organisations themselves are sometimes part of the problem.
Oh,
I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit on that, and maybe without mentioning particular organisations, what was the problem there?
okay, well, if I wanted to, I could probably have written an expose of all the things aid donors and organisations like the UN or the World Bank or the IMF, all the things they can do wrong. It would be quite easy to do because, like any big organisation, makes mistakes. And sometimes money is not, I won't say it's wasted, I'm just saying it's not spent as well as it could be. One example I would say would be in Afghanistan. The Japanese government very kindly donated some buses to provide public transport in this very rundown city. Unfortunately, they chose Japanese buses, which were current state-of-the-art buses with sort of computer-controlled engines and air conditioning and automatic doors and things like that, which are pretty good in Tokyo. But the streets, the roads of all are potholes, some of them are just gravel, they flood in winter. And also the people, it's very crowded. People like to cram as many people on a bus as possible. So the government would much prefer that they'd actually just given the money, because with the same amount of money, they could have bought about 10 times as many Indian buses that are built for Indian, fairly rugged buses built for the sort of conditions you have in Afghanistan. So, you know, it's a well-meaning gesture by Japan, but it wasn't necessarily the best. Donors do that a lot. They spend money on things that may not really be helping. Yes, so that would be one example. I've also, as I mentioned, you get young experts who come from a consulting firm or from the World Bank, and they spend 2 weeks in the country and they say, do a report and say, you should throw away everything that you do now and do, well, usually it's either something they've learned at university last year or something they do in their own country. They don't really understand the situation. They can't possibly understand the situation because they've only been there 2 weeks. Whereas most of the work I've done has been on long-term projects where you really get to sit in the government office and find out exactly what they do and exactly where the problems are, and ideally help them to work out whether they need to change and what the solution is that they want to adopt.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so in the book, just getting back to the book, there's quite a bit of information about the sort of work I and my colleagues were doing, and a few examples of things that didn't work as they should, but also examples of things that did work and things that were a positive development. Because the aid work, although I'm an aid worker, I'm not the sort of aid worker that does humanitarian work. The people, you know, I really admire them because they go to war zones, they go to refugee camps and work in very difficult conditions. Really, my work was pretty comfortable. There were problems, but I worked in an office, I worked in a city. It wasn't really all that, to me, it wasn't all that difficult. But I work on long-term development issues.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever feel your safety was under threat?
Oh, well, that's a bit strange. I never really felt, even though there were situations where we were under a lot of tight security, I strangely enough, I didn't really feel scared, even when after my first few weeks in Kosovo, a bomb went off outside my hotel window in the middle of the night.
Wow.
And even then, I mean, it's, I woke up and I just, strangely enough, I wasn't at all frightened. I wasn't, I just thought, well, life has been pretty strange since I left home, and this is just another strange thing.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't actually a very large bomb, and it was a rocket grenade that had been fired in that direction from underneath my hotel window, and it hadn't actually done any damage. But yes, that was the nearest I've, you know, there've been a few explosions, but not really close. One night I was in Kabul and I woke up and I thought, oh, it's thunder, the thunderstorm, and went back to sleep. Next morning they say, did you hear the bomb? The bomb that landed about 3 blocks down there. But no, it's just, yeah, I actually think that I've got more chance of being hit by a car in Adelaide than I have of being suffering in you know, a terrorist attack or something, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. So it doesn't mean it wouldn't happen.
Yeah, well, I think from the outside it looks like you're either brave or crazy. We're not sure which, but that's a little bit of both.
Brave, so yeah, crazy.
So tell us a little bit about why, I mean, you came home after 16 years and thought, I've got to put all of this down on paper, or what made you write the book?
Oh, well, it goes back much earlier than that, because I actually kept diaries while I was, you know, literally the day I was at the airport to leave, I thought, this is just so exciting. I've got to write it down. Yeah. And I got a notebook at the airport and started writing absolutely everything. You know, what did I eat on the plane? Everything. As if, you know, you'd think I'd never been overseas before. So I kept that up. I wrote emails back to, long emails to people, and some of them said they were interesting. But really, I just kept writing in my notebooks for a long time, and sometimes typing it up, put it away, and then when I had some spare time, I went over it again, and the first thing I did was actually put it on a website. I created a website and put lots of the stories on the website. And
is that still the same one that you have today, called Where Are You This Time?
Yeah, that's how it started. So, you know, there's not so much. I took it off the website and turn it into the book, and I had to into a book. Eventually, I thought, yeah, that in the last few years, I thought, well, I might as well. So I had to do a lot of editing. I had to shorten it. Some of my favourite people I had to delete because the just didn't fit in with the flow. Some of them were interesting stories. Just it was quite difficult. And yeah, so and then I had to think about how to publish it. But yeah, and there were lots of decisions to make. I had, you know, the writing part was actually quite easy, given that I had so much material. cutting it back, but also the more, I think every sentence has been revised about 20 times. I just kept looking at it and trying to make it think what would be interesting. How can I express this?
Is there a story or a little anecdote that you had to leave out, but you really wished you could have included that one?
Oh, well, there's quite a few. One of the people, well, there are a couple of people that were originally in the book, but I felt that they, you know, it was a little bit, wasn't a consistent story. One of the people was a friend I made in Kabul, Shakriya, who worked as an interpreter, and she had had a very interesting background, because when the Soviet Union invaded, she was a student when the Soviet Union was in Afghanistan, and she'd actually learnt Russian, and she'd gone and studied in the Soviet Union, so she had a degree and came back and was working, and then the Taliban took over, so they wouldn't let anyone work. And like many women in Afghanistan, she talked about when she was a student and when she was young, and how women wore miniskirts and had long hair and nobody wore a scarf.
She just can't imagine that.
Yes, and it's totally unlike that now. But that was only in the 70s. Actually, it was the 80s. But then the Taliban took over. Women couldn't work. She was working as an accountant, but she managed to work for a hospital, and she got in there by being a patient. She got in as a patient and then went and did the books and then went home again. So when the Taliban left, she learnt English. Her English and good enough to be an interpreter, and she ended up getting a scholarship to go to the US. So she's a intelligent, very determined, very ambitious woman. So she was one of the people I really wanted to write about, her and her family, but it just didn't fit. It's very sad.
Yeah. I suppose you had to be ruthless when it comes to, formulas with publishing, and, be really specific about what readers want to read. Was that a tricky process for you?
Okay. Yes, I had different conflicting advice on some things. For instance, I tried to make it a lot more than just about me, and not to get away from the I did this and then I did that and then I did that. Although I realise now there's a pattern that almost every chapter starts with arriving at an airport.
As you do.
Yeah. And where am I now? And just first impressions. But I also include a bit of the history of the countries and the politics. And that's where there was a debate, because I got advice that said, oh no, you don't want to you don't want to tell people all that, they can Google it. And other people said, no, that's important. We want to know. So I've tried to strike a balance and tried not to make it a lecture or a history book, but to just fill in some of the details about how we got to the situation we're in at the moment.
Yeah. In fact, I read a lot of reviews of this book, and many people are really grateful for those little pockets of history that you provide. They're not elaborate, and they don't go on and on. It's just enough so that people can understand your experiences.
Yeah. Well, I think a few first drafts did go on and on a bit.
Okay.
That it was a bit tedious, and either broke it up or just shortened it a lot. Because I'm fascinated by the history and by the politics in these countries and the problems they're facing and how on earth they're going to get out of it. So that's one of the things the book is about. It's also partly about me and how I started off all naive and overwhelmed by it, and became a bit routine after a while. And as I said, it's also about what aid donors do, the things they do well and the things they maybe don't do so well sometimes.
Would you like to share your experiences with actually getting the book published?
Right, okay. So that was also quite a long process, and I gave up several times. I put it on I thought...
As every author in the history of the world.
Okay, yes, I'm always relieved to hear that from other people. So I did. So I started off thinking, I think this is interesting. surely a publisher would want it, and obviously I'm going to be a real writer, so I'm going to have a publisher. And I sent it off. I followed the rules and sent it off to several publishers, and that was very frustrating because they don't give you I didn't get acknowledgements, I didn't get replies. They basically said, if you don't hear from us for, say, 3 months, then you'll assume we're not interested, which I think is a bit rude. They could just send off an email acknowledgement, so at least you know they've got it. And officially, you can only go to one publisher at a time, so that I figured if I went to all the publishers there are, that would take about 10 years and they might still reject it. So the way I see conventional publishing is it's like a funnel with masses of interesting stories in it and a tiny pinprick down the bottom, particularly in Australia, maybe 1 or 2 drip out the bottom. And who knows how many writers give up during that process. So it seems that mainly in this, particularly in the non-fiction field, the people who are published, they either know someone or they are someone. So they are a celebrity or a journalist, or they have they have connections, they know people. And they're not necessarily good books. In some of them I've read, I've thought they were badly edited and badly written, and yet they're published by a reputable publisher, but who knows why, and yet some self-published books aren't that bad. So I actually did give up for a while, and then I found out a bit more about self-publishing and how technology has changed publishing and is changing it quite a lot, because you can publish an ebook for nothing. You can sell it for a few dollars, and anyone can read it. It's very relatively easy to do. And print-on-demand paperbacks means you no longer have to print a whole warehouse full of books and hope someone buys them. You can just print them when there's interest in the book. So I think that is quite a, I was convinced that that would be the way to go. However, I did actually get some help, some professional help, and I would recommend that anyone who's thinking of doing this does the same. I got an editor proofreader, and I've actually done a lot of proofreading in the past, and I thought, oh, this is easy, I can do this. Or I could get my friends to do it. Well, you can't expect your friends to give you an honest opinion or to actually find all your mistakes. And the editor, I think, did a brilliant job in spotting things I would never have noticed that were wrong, or unscrambling sentences that made sense to me, but maybe not to anyone else. Not a lot of them, but a few. And I also got help with the design and formatting of the book. This is the cover. And I had a photo that looked more or less like that I took myself. This is in Afghanistan. But it wasn't technically, I was going to use it, but technically it wasn't good enough. So they found another photo, and it was sort of this style of cover that I wanted. So I'm really pleased that I spent a little bit of money, and I didn't think it was that expensive. And then the other help I had was a little bit of help with publicity, because that is something that's, perhaps if you do have a publisher, they know the bookshop people and the review people, and they can do the publicity. That's probably the main advantage. But I did get a publicist to send out some press releases and try and get a little bit of attention on the book. Still working on that, because, international coverage, and because I think this will be interesting to people, not just in Australia. It's not an Australian story, really. And social media and internet publicity, that's a tricky one. So that's my publishing story. for people who are interested in that part of it.
So just for our attendees who are logging in or zooming in with us, if you've got a question for Mary, please do type that into the Q&A box. I've got a few more questions here, but you know, if you want to know more about her time in these countries, then please, now's your time to ask. So my next question that I had is, so if you were you know, selling your book, I guess, what would you say that readers are going to get out of this? What will be their take home?
Right. Well, I think, I hope that the main thing is going to be what the situation, you know, what the problems are in countries like the ones I've been to, especially post-conflict countries, or maybe still in conflict countries like Afghanistan. And one of the things is the devastating effects of conflict, of war, and just the ruined buildings in Kabul, and the lack of security, simply the inability of people to know what's going on when there is a conflict. It takes so long to recover. So the devastation of conflict, and how important it is to have an effective government. Mm. When I went to Pristina, they'd just had a short conflict, and I looked around town and thought, well, this must be all war damage, you know, leaking water in the streets and buildings falling down. But in fact, it wasn't. I found out that they hadn't actually been much fighting or bombing in that city. It was actually that they hadn't had an effective government for about 10 years. So, for example, the sewer pipes were leaking. The roads were all potholed. Manhole covers were missing. There was garbage everywhere. No one was collecting the garbage. People just parked their cars anywhere because no one was enforcing the parking restrictions. People could build a house anywhere, you know, without having to actually own the land or get planning permission or things like that.
What a mess.
Like I said, these are things we take for granted until they're not there. And so perhaps it's a reply to people who support a small government approach. We're finding out that governments can be pretty important. And when you go to countries like that, you can see how important it is to have a good government.
So just talking about all the, you know, the infrastructure that just isn't there. But what else were you like most shocked by while you were in these countries?
Shocked. Well, yeah, the working conditions that, yeah. I mean, I keep thinking about Afghanistan because that would have to be one of the most interesting places I've worked in. The people were turning up to work every day in an office that basically had a concrete floor. Like the furniture was about 40 years old and broken. They had no heating in winter, and it snows there in winter. They had a very, very small, very low rate of pay, and didn't necessarily get their pay regularly, although these people were working in the city, and in fact they were working in the department that was responsible for paying people, so they probably got it a bit more regularly than people who lived out in the countryside. But the working conditions were appalling. The toilets were smelly. It was really difficult. And I visited the woman I was talking about. She invited me to her home for lunch one day. They were quite well off. It was quite a nice house once upon a time. And she showed me the bathroom, which had a chip wood heater. which they had to fire up whenever she wanted to have a bath or a shower. And it occurred to me that, and there was no other heating. I mean, there was a kerosene heater and that was it. And I understood, you know, how difficult her home circumstances were. And she was actually well off, so that just goes to show. And I thought of all the people that I worked with getting up and trying to get dressed for work with cold water in winter, with maybe a chip heater to heat it, if that. And the fact, you know, and you would never get that impression from working with them. It's only when you go to their homes that you understand how difficult it is for them.
So living conditions were really something that were quite tricky to swallow.
Well, a lot of it. The inequality, I mean, I could talk about the Philippines as well, where you have extremely rich people. You have people who are extremely rich. And then you have 2 blocks away, you have people who sleep on cardboard who live in a cardboard box, basically. So I, you know, that's another thing that shocked me.
The poverty
in all these countries, but particularly in some countries that really should know better.
Yeah.
Should be
We've got
better.
a viewer question by Donna. She's asking, Mary, do you think that donors learn from their mistakes?
Okay, in a word, probably no. To the extent that any large bureaucratic organisation, you could say that about any large organisation. I guess over time they might get better, and maybe they avoid the worst. Yeah, I think they probably have learned something over the years. For example, the Japanese buses, they did come with 5 years of free servicing and parts, whereas in the past there was a tendency to give a donation of, you know, a new school or something and then just not worry about who was going to look after it afterwards. And so many projects to build something don't look at the other part of it, the maintenance, the teachers, you know, it's not just building a road or building a hospital. It is more to do with the people and the systems and the management. That's much more important than just the physical infrastructure. So do donors learn from their mistakes? Very gradually. But the people are turning over all the time. So one person might learn and the organisation might think it's learned, and then it just goes back to doing what it did before.
Mary and I were speaking earlier about, you know, would you return to any of these countries? And she said, yes, I would. And I was quite surprised. But when you do go back to these countries, do you think to yourself, actually, I did make a difference? Or are you too humble to say that?
Look, it's so...
Did you make a little bit of a difference?
I mean, certainly things... In some of the countries I've been to, things have definitely improved. Kosovo is one, you don't hear about it anymore. But to what extent, you know, who was responsible for that? Would it have happened anyway? Was the aid project really what did it? It's fairly diffuse and pretty hard to tell. I did think that in Somalia, where I was working with a couple of state governments setting up new governments, and I like to think that the work we did with them helped them to do their job better. They were completely new to the whole idea of working for the government. And there's a little bit of good news in Somalia in that there are some areas that are not as subject to conflict as they were. But it's still a long way to go.
So you feel like it's a long way to go still?
In all of these countries, yes. And Afghanistan is, probably going backwards at the moment.
And would you ever go over there again?
To Afghanistan, I said I would love to go to Afghanistan again when that was peaceful. Not so much because I'm worried. Well, my relatives and friends are worried about me going to some of these places, which is one reason why I've ruled out going back to some of them. It's mainly because the fact that there's so much security. You're restricted in where you can go, what you can do, how much time you can spend in a particular place. For instance, the last time I went there to Kabul, which is a while ago now, but I had to have two security guards with me everywhere I went, and we went in an armoured vehicle, and I could only have meetings for a couple of hours with the government officials. So you can't really get anything done, and you can't get to know people. So it's just inconvenient more than anything else. So,
and ineffective.
And not terribly effective, I wouldn't think. But it has become more dangerous there. But I would be interested to go back to most of the countries that I've been to. Not Libya, not Somalia, not at the moment, but Kosovo and the Balkans I would like to visit again. Yes, definitely.
Okay. So, like I said, I read a few reviews, and Nikki Page from Radio Adelaide says that your book is a readable account of how Mary Venner learns to not only survive, but to function effectively in a bizarre range of challenging circumstances. Yeah. Did you want to comment on that one?
Function effectively, yeah. I mean, it wasn't a matter of surviving. It was actually sometimes, depending on the place, it's actually quite fun. If there are a lot of other people working there who support you. I like, a lot of places I've been working as part of a team, quite a large team. So there's not only the work colleagues, but also there's a bit of social life. In other places, it's been pretty lonely and not much to do. And I didn't speak, no one who spoke my English, and that could be difficult. Yeah, but that's when I found time to write in my diary. Look at it that way. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Mary, thank you so much for your time tonight. We wish you every success with this memoir.
Yep.
And to our listeners, thank you so much for zooming in with us online, and we hope that you've enjoyed your time with Mary. If this has sparked an interest, please support Mary and our local bookshops, including Dimmicks, where you can buy the book there. But any bookseller can order this memoir in for you. Of course, Mary's memoir is also available on many ebook platforms.
Yes.
So
I strongly recommend the ebook because it's quick and easy to get. And you can order it online. But if you want the paperback, you can get it online from quite a lot of places. Just Google it.
Okay. Well, thank you again, and follow Burnside Library on Facebook and Instagram to keep up with our upcoming webinars and author events. Hope you have a lovely evening, everyone, and thank you again to Mary.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, good night, everybody.